Hello, friends. Welcome to Science Talk. I am your host, Jim Massa. And in this video presentation, I want to discuss ice algae. I just did a recent video segment. We were talking about, finding snow and ice algae in Antarctica, Greenland, and the Arctic Ocean, and so on, as other places as well. And so I want to discuss with you what is ice algae. So here we go. Ice algae are any of the various types of algal communities found in annual and multi-year sea or terrestrial ice. On sea ice in the polar oceans, ice algae communities play an important role in primary production. You've heard me talk about ice edge productivity effects, that when the sea ice begins to melt, it creates a little stratification area activity. I'll be discussing this in more detail later on in this presentation. The timing of blooms of the algae is especially important for supporting higher trophic levels at times of the year when light is low, ice cover still exists. Sea ice algal communities are mostly concentrated in the bottom layer of the ice, but can also occur in brine channels within the ice, in melt ponds, and on the surface. So what are brine channels? As the oceanic waters cool down, and remember, for oceanic water to freeze because of the solutes, the higher salt content, which we measure as salinity, you have to cool the water temperature cooler than 0 degrees C. But in the process of doing that, any salt is ejected from the ice crystals as it formed. That's called brine rejection. The brine channels are those salts moving through the ice as upper layers are freezing and it moves down here. Because what's happening as you're taking the ice, the oceanic water, making the ice, you're leaving behind the salt. So you are doing what? You are increasing the concentration of the salt in the liquid portion that remains. You're therefore increasing its density, and it's going to sink. We see such thing. You can actually see you see these little brine plumes in the liquid water. You can see brine channels within the ice itself. So, and that's a very important principle that helps drive a lot of the productivity. It drives a lot of the movement of the water. So when the ice forms, you can, aside from whatever algal organism you may encounter, another organism, you can melt that ice, strain it, and then drink it. Because the salt, brine rejection, is in the liquid portion. So why is it called sea ice? Because the derivation of the ice is from the sea when it freezes. Terrestrial ice algae occur in freshwater systems. Species compositions differs greatly from that of sea ice algae. These communities are significant in that they often change the color of glaciers and ice sheets, impacting the reflectivity of the ice itself. Right? And I showed that to you when I did that video segment discussing what's going on with the Antarctic ice sheets. So here is a photo of sea ice algae. Right, you can see these looks like filamentous stuff here. So this is the ice, and where the filaments are reaching into is the liquid portion. But you can see here, these are all filamentous algae. Microbial life in sea ice is extremely diverse and includes abundant algae, bacteria, protozoa. Algae in particular dominate the Symphysic Environment. I'll explain that in a moment. With estimates of more than 1,000 unicellular eukaryotes. Eukaryotes are organisms that have cell organelles in the cytoplasm and a well-defined nucleus with the genetic materials surrounded by a nuclear membrane. And so found associated with sea ice in the Arctic. Species composition and diversity vary based on location, ice type, irradiance. Irradiance is, I will describe later on in this video segment, is tied into albedo and sunlight energy, reflectance, absorption, that sort of thing. In general, pinnate diatoms such as Nitsia frigida in the Arctic, right, frigid, and Fragilariopsis cylindrus in the Antarctic. That should have been also italicized. My bad. And then we have Melocera arctica, which forms up to meter-long filaments attached to the bottom of the ice, also widespread in the Arctic, an important food source for marine species. Okay, symphysic environment is one where water exists mostly as a solid ice, such as the polar ice cap or glacier. Solid sea ice is permeated with channels filled with salty brine. These briny channels in the sea ice itself have its ecology, referred to as symphysic ecology. Residents of temperate and tropical climates often assume mistakenly that ice and snow are devoid of life, and that is not the case. A number of varieties of algae, such as diatoms, engage in photosynthesis in Arctic and alpine regions of Earth. Other energy sources include aeolian dust and pollen swept in from other regions. You have, for example, dust being blown from the African continent, gets blown over the Atlantic Ocean. Some of it will end up in North America, in the Arctic Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, etc. Other energy sources include, I already said that. These ecosystems also include bacteria and fungi, as well as animals like flatworms and crustaceans. A number of symphysic worm species are commonly called ice worms. Additionally, the ocean has abundant plankton. Prolific algal blooms occur in the polar regions each summer, as well as in high mountain lakes, bringing nutrients to those parts of the ice in contact with the water. In the spring, krill, which are crustaceans, like shrimp-like critters, can scrape off the green lawn of ice algae from the underside of the pack ice. There's a photo of krill grazing on symphysic ice algae. Now, these are all the krill. And you can see the green here, so they're just sitting there having dinner. So I'll be, discussing the importance of, this its own ecology, which I've already alluded to earlier. You get the ice melt and so on. Very important aspect of productivity in high latitudes and high altitudes. If you go up like alpine glaciers up high in the mountains. Order Pinellas is a traditional. The order Pinellas is a traditional subdivision of the heterocont algae known as diatoms. The order is named for the shape of the cell wall, sometimes called valves or frustules, of pinnate diatoms, which are elongated in valve view. The valves may be linear or oval in shape and usually bear bilateral symmetrical ornamental patterns. Now, if it's diatom, these are typically made of silica. Okay? Patterns are composed of a series of transverse lines known as stria that can appear as rows of dots when viewed with an optical microscope. Some pinnate diatoms also exhibit a fissure along the longitudinal axis known as a raphe and is involved in gliding movements made by diatom cells. Motile diatoms that move, always possess a raphe. So here's a picture of diatoms. Here's some of the longitudinal ones here. Let's see. So this is a typical stuff here. You drop in a plankton net and you pull up a sample and you see stuff like this. These are all diatoms. Various shapes, angles that they're viewed on, from above, from the side, front view, back view, what have you. But this gives you an idea of diatom. And what you're looking at here are the shells that contain the organisms, or tests, they're sometimes called. And you can see the variety You see some ones like this one seems to see a lot of that particular variety in this photo, but you can see other shapes and other forms. So all these different species. And this, of course, is adding to productivity. While sea ice algal communities are found throughout the column of sea ice, abundance community composition depends on the time of year. There are many microhabitats available to algae on and within the sea ice, and different algal groups have different preferences. For example, in late winter, early spring, motile diatoms like N. frigida have been found to dominate the uppermost layers of the ice. As far as briny channels reach, and their abundance is greater in multi-year ice, MYI, than in first-year ice, FYI. So FYI, in this context, does not mean for your information. It means first-year ice. Additionally, dinoflagellates have also been found to dominate in the early austral spring in Antarctic sea ice. Diatoms and dinoflagellates, or dinoflagellates, however you want to pronounce that, they are different groups of phytoplankton. Keep that in mind. So we will see, depending on the time of year, depending on the location, depending on the age of the ice, you will see different phytoplankton groups dominate. Here's a brine pocket filled with a penne diatoms, right? So there's a diatom there, right? It's all these here are diatoms. And this is a little pocket within the ice. Right? That's most likely, that's probably an air bubble. But the diatom specifically is this, over here, here, and here. And you can see a nice clustering in there. And for scale, this is 100 microns, which is basically 0.1 millimeter across. So from here to here. So this, if you go straight across here, it's probably about 2 millimeters or so, plus or minus. The ice algal communities can also thrive at the surface of the ice and surface melt ponds and in layers where rafting has occurred. That's where the sea ice is moving, and maybe they kind of crunch up to form ridges and so on. In melt ponds, dominant algal types can vary with the pond salinity, with higher concentration of diatoms being found in melt ponds with higher salinity. Because of the adaptation to low light conditions, the presence of ice algae, particularly vertical positioning ice pack, is primarily limited by nutrient availability. Okay. I'm going to have another lengthy video presentation discussing productivity, ice water not ice water, but water stratification and mixing. Okay. Generally speaking, you need two things to have a productivity in a water column: fresh water, seawater, no matter. You need mixing to bring nutrients available into the photic zone, and then you need stratification or stabilization of a water layer in order for the phytoplankton to do their thing. Okay. Now, another thing you notice, adaptation to low light. A test made of silica, as typical for diatom, is more translucent to sunlight energy than, say, tests made by the coccolithophores, which tend to be more calcite. Calcite is far more opaque; less light will be penetrating through. I'm not saying it won't, but less light. So let's go back to the photos there, right? You can see how translucent it is. So light energy is more readily going to go through there and reach the chloroplast. So it's another adaptation why you find diatoms primarily in cold water, because their tessemated silica, it's better adapted to the low light conditions. So the highest concentrations are found at the base of the ice because the porosity of the ice enables nutrient infiltration from seawater. That's an important aspect. So nutrients are going to move in, through the fusion, however other methods, and it's got your nitrates and phosphates and what have you. And so since it's more readily going to penetrate the lower portion of the ice, the diatoms need that nutrients. They're going to go there as opposed to further up in the ice. To survive the harsh sea ice environment, organisms must be able to endure extreme variation in salinity, temperature, solar radiation. Algae living in brine channels can secrete osmolytes. Okay, lights is a reference to cells. So these are cells, basically salt-secreting cells is how that translates. Okay, and so one of the things that they can secrete is dimethyl sulfonio-propionate, DMSP. You can see why we just say DMSP. That's a bit of a mouthful, which allows them to survive the high salinities in the channels after the ice formation in the winter, as well as low salinities when a relatively fresh meltwater flushes the channel in the spring and summer. We'll talk a bit about that later on. Some sea ice algae species secrete ice binding proteins, IBP, as a gelatinous extracellular polymeric substance, EPS, that protects the cell membranes from damage from ice crystal growth and freeze-thaw cycles. Remember, when water freezes, it expands. And if it's, it could expand inside the cell and you pop the cell membrane and it kills the unicellular organism. EPS alters the microstructure of the ice and creates further habitat for future bloom. So basically, it's protecting the organisms from the effects of the freeze and thaw cycles. Surface-dwelling algae produce special pigments to prevent damage from harsh UV radiation. Higher concentrations of xanthophyll, which is yellow pigments, act as a sunscreen that protects ice algae from photo damage when they are exposed to damaging levels of ultraviolet radiation upon transition from ice to the water column during the spring. And oftentimes you might actually see like, oh, that appears to be a yellowish tinge, and that's the algae secreting the xanthophylls to protect themselves. Algae under thick ice have been reported to show some of the most extreme low light adaptations ever observed. Extreme efficiency in light utilization allows sea ice algae to build up biomass rapidly when light conditions improve at the onset of spring. And then the zooplankton graze on that, and then small fish graze on the zooplankton, bigger fish graze on the smaller fish, etc. Now, this is a photo. Right? You can see a scuba diver here. This is the hole in the ice. So this is a ladder sticking down. So however long that ladder is, this will go to the surface. This is his only escape out of here. This is all ice. Right? But we see differing patterns of darkness and lightness and so on. Here's some algae. Okay. And it looks like he's got some sort of looks like a long tether here. Oh, I think that's a spare pony bottle. A pony bottle is a small reserve oxygen bottle for scuba divers. So if he's underneath here and he starts running out of air, or if he needs to make a decompression stop, then this will be a reserve air tank for him to breathe while making his decompression stop. And that looks like a decompression stop at a 10-foot level. That's just by looking at that. So, snow at the surface reduces light availability. That's the dark patches in specific areas, and thus the ability of algae to grow. Light patches where no snow on the surface of ice, sunlight penetrates. So where you see this, those dark patches, there's snow on the ice. Where you see this, a little lighter, there's no snow on the ice. Sunlight is able to make its way through. Translucent, however, but it's able to make its way through. And, not surprisingly, you're going to find the algae. So that's what's going on in that photo. I wanted to put that caption in to explain that. Okay. Excuse me. Role in the ecosystem. Ice algae play a critical role in primary production. Okay. Now I'm going to get into it. And serve as part of the base of the polar food web by converting CO2 and inorganic nutrients to oxygen, organic matter through photosynthesis in the upper ocean, both the Arctic and Antarctic. Within the Arctic, estimates of the contribution of sea ice algae to the total primary production ranges from 3 to 25%, up to 50 to 57% in the high Arctic regions. Keep those values, 50 to 57%. Keep that in mind later on. Sea ice algae accumulate biomass rapidly, often at the base of sea ice, grow to form algal mats, which are consumed by amphipods, krill, and copepods. Amphipods is another group of crustaceans. Ultimately, these organisms are eaten by fish, whales, penguins, dolphins, depending where you've been. Penguins, obviously, in the Southern Ocean. When sea ice algal communities detach from the sea ice, they are consumed by pelagic grazers, such as zooplankton, as they sink through the water column, and by benthic organisms as they settle on the sea floor. I probably should have also included here, in addition to benthic invertebrates, but epibenthic invertebrates. Benthic organisms are organisms that live in the substrate itself. Epibenthic are organisms that live right on the substrate of the seafloor itself. So there is a difference. So benthic is in the substrate, epi is on the substrate, on the seafloor. Sea ice algae as food are rich in polyunsaturated and other essential fatty acids and are the exclusive producer of certain essential omega-3 fatty acids that are important for copepod egg production, egg hatching, and zooplankton growth and function. This is a very important step there. The zooplankton are grazing. Copepods are the type of zooplankton. They're a crustacean. They graze on the phytoplankton. That the omega-3 fatty acids, they then turn into lipids. And oftentimes you will see on a copepod, like say a pseudocalanus copepod, they will have these these droplets, which are lipids. And the lipids are used for egg production, in which the eggs then used to hatch, and as well as growth. So very important. Temporal variation. The timing of sea ice algae blooms has a significant impact on the entire ecosystem. Initiation of the bloom is primarily controlled by the return of the sun in the spring. Solar angle is a critical factor. Because of this, ice algae blooms usually occurs before the blooms of pelagic phytoplankton, which require higher light levels, higher solar angle, and warmer water. This is extremely critical. Algal blooms occur before the blooms of pelagic is open water. This is tying into what I'll talk about later, with ice edge productivity. And I'll discuss later on the implications of what's happening with the sea ice in the Arctic and how this is really bad news. Early in the season, prior to the ice melt, sea ice algae constitute an important food source for the higher trophic levels. However, the total percentage that sea ice algae contribute to the primary production of a given ecosystem depends strongly on the extent of ice cover. The thickness of snow on the sea ice also affects the timing and size of the ice algae bloom by altering light transmission. Think back to the photo I just shared with you. If you have a lot of snow, that's going to limit ice penetration, sunlight penetration into the ice. Okay. The sensitivity to ice and snow cover has the potential to cause a mismatch between predators and the food source, sea ice algae within the ecosystem. The so-called match-mismatch hypothesis has been applied to a variety of systems. Examples have been seen in relationship between zooplankton species, which rely on sea ice algae and phytoplankton for food, and juvenile walleye pollock in the Bering Sea. So in other words, if, for whatever reason, the sea ice either it melts and the algae bloom, say later, then when the walleye pollock are getting ready to feed, there's not going to be enough zooplankton for them to feed on because the primary productivity has already occurred, or has not yet occurred. So there aren't enough zooplankton for them to feed on. However, on the flip side of it, if the sea ice bloom, the algal bloom occurs earlier than usual, then the zooplankton could be feeding earlier, but then they're growing faster, and they may become too big for the walleyes to ingest, or they simply move away and the walleye polyps will not encounter them. So this is a very tight timing. We see the same thing with birds migrating, to expecting the timing they're breeding and the hatching of the eggs to coincide with when the insects are going to be flying around, so they can grab the insects and feed their chicks. Well, if the sea ice is blooming later, there's not going to be zooplankton for the walleye to feed on. If it's blooming, the bloom takes place earlier, the zooplankton can grow and move out of the area before the walleye can ingest them. There's several ways in which sea ice algal blooms are thought to start their annual cycle. Hypotheses about these vary depending on water column depth, sea ice age, taxonomic group. And you can throw in the angle of the sun, the thickness of the, that's the sea ice age, it ties in the sea ice age, the thickness of the sea ice, the distribution where it's found. Where sea ice overlays deep ocean, it is proposed that cells trapped in multi-year ice brine pockets are reconnected to the water column below and quickly colonize nearby ice of all ages. This is known as the multi-year sea ice repository hypothesis. The seeding source has been demonstrated in diatoms, which dominate symphysic blooms, right? We know what that is now. Other groups such as the dinoflagellates, which also bloom in the spring, summer, have been shown to maintain low cell numbers in the water column itself and do not primarily overwinter within the ice. That's the dinoflagellates. Where sea ice covers oceans that are somewhat shallower, resuspension of cells from the sediment may occur. So this is kind of more of the neristic areas as opposed to more pelagic zones. So I wanted to pull up an actual abstract from a study, The Seeding of Ice Algal Blooms in Arctic Pack Ice, the Multi-Year Ice Seed Repository Hypothesis, published, written by Olson and others, published July 2017 in the Journal of Geophysical Research, Biogeosciences, Volume 122, Issue 7. Here are your page numbers. Here's the abstract. During the Norwegian Yangtze Ice Expedition, NICE 2015, from January to June 2015, the pack ice in the Arctic Ocean north of Svalbard was studied during 4 drifts between 83 degrees north and 83 north and 80 degrees north latitude. This pack ice consisted of a mix of second year, first year, and young ice. The physical properties and ice algal community composition was investigated in the 3 different ice types during the winter, spring, summer transition. Our results indicate that algae remaining in sea ice that survived the summer melt season are subsequently trapped in the upper layers of the ice column during winter and may function as an algal seed repository. Once the connectivity in the entire ice column is established as a result of temperature-driven increase in ice porosity during spring, algae in the upper parts of the ice are able to migrate towards the bottom and initiate the ice algal spring bloom. Furthermore, this algal repository might seed the bloom in younger ice formed in adjacent leads. This mechanism was studied in detail for the dominant ice diatom and basically the Knitsia frigida that I mentioned earlier. The proposed seeding mechanism may be compromised due to the disappearance of older ice and the anticipated regime shift towards a seasonally ice-free Arctic Ocean. Okay. Now you see why that I usually do not, when I just make my video segments for you guys, I do not just go through the papers. Bit dry reading. So what I do is I do go through these papers, but I summarize them, and then I look with more scientists are now doing interviews, and I research, find their interviews pertaining to the paper that I'm citing, so that I can bring it to you in, shall we say, a less dry manner. So basically what they're saying is, okay, if they survive, they go to the bottom, and then they help, spread out. Basically, this is how you can sum this up here. But this is typical scientific writing, extremely dry. but there it is. Okay, so just to go back, where sea ice overlays deep ocean is proposed cells trapped in multi-year ice brine pockets reconnected to water column below, and they quickly colonize nearby ice of all ages. And that seeding source has been demonstrated in diatoms. Okay, so that's me summarizing that. Well, it takes me a while to do this. That's why I'm not putting out 3-4 video segments every day. I'm translating it. But anyway, so it's an actual abstract from that research article. Okay, let's get into we just saw at the end here, anticipated regime shift towards a seasonally ice-free Arctic Ocean. Okay, implications of the climate change. That's what that last sentence refers to. Climate change and warming of the Arctic and Antarctic regions have the potential to greatly alter ecosystem functioning. Decreasing ice cover in polar regions is expected to lessen the relative proportion of sea ice algae production to measures of annual primary production. The thinning ice allows for greater production early in the season, but early ice melting shortens the overall growing season of the sea ice algae. This melting also contributes to stratification of the water column that alters the availability of nutrients for algae growth by decreasing the depth of the surface mix layer, inhibiting the upwelling of nutrients from deep waters. This is expected to cause an overall shift towards pelagic phytoplankton production. Changes in multi-year ice volume will also have an impact on ecosystem function in terms of bloom seeding source adjustment. Reduction in multi-year ice, a temporal refugia for diatoms in particular, will likely alter symphysic community composition, resulting in bloom initialization that derives from species that overwinter in a water column or sediments instead. So this point here about the thinning ice. Right now, we have the diatoms, that exist that start this whole productivity as the sea ice melts, and you get that melting, you get that little bit of a stratification, and therefore then they have these nutrients locked in, and there's productivity there. And then when you take in the extent of the area that the sea ice covers as it melts, that's a lot of productivity. But if the sea ice is disappearing, you're not going to have this productivity. And don't forget, these algae, the diatoms that exist as the sea ice melts, they can activate at low angles of the sun. If you start having more and more open water, less and less ice, you have to wait for the pelagic phytoplankton, more open water species, to start doing their photosynthesis. However, they need a higher angle of the sun to be activated. So this is why that when you look at the total productivity over the season between the algae at the ice edge and the pelagic later on, by having less and less sea ice, there's less and less productivity as well, which then, of course, affects the whole food chain and food web. That's basically the situation that's happening. So, to kind of drive home this point, less and less sea ice forms, the extent decreases, this important community can disappear altogether. In the Arctic Ocean, as the sea ice melts, a mini stratification occurs that creates stability in the upper water layers. This allows for primary productivity to take place, fueling this food web. This is called ice edge productivity. It is a very important aspect of Arctic productivity. No ice, no stratification, no primary productivity, no food web. You have to wait much later when the sun angle increases so that the pelagic phytoplankton can do their thing. But as I just said, overall, there'll be less productivity and there will be detrimental to the food web. But also, you have certain species that, in certain communities, that depend on the ice edge productivity, the ecosystem that meltwater, that stratification provides. You don't have that stratification, you're not going to have that particular community. So the pelagic community be different from the ice edge communities. Because sea ice algae are often the base of the food web, these alterations have implications for species of higher trophic levels, the reproduction and migration cycles of many polar primary consumers. Primary consumers are your heterotrophs, basically your zooplankton, those kind of organisms. The time of the bloom of sea ice algae, meaning that a change in the timing or location of primary production could shift the distribution of prey populations necessary for significant keystone species. This goes back to the match-mismatch hypothesis. Production timing may also be altered by the melting through of surface melt ponds to the seawater below, which can alter sea ice algal habitat late in the growing season in such a way as to impact grazing communities as winter nears. The production of DMSP by sea ice algae also plays an important role in the carbon cycle. DMSP is oxidized by other plankton to dimethyl sulfide, commonly referred to as DMS, a compound which is linked to cloud formation. Basically, it helps form clouds, and the thinking, now while clouds, the underside of clouds may trap heat, the top side of clouds will reflect the solar energy back into space. Part of the reason why incorporating clouds into climate models is extremely difficult, because it is difficult to ascertain exactly how much reflectance of sun energy back into space occurs and how much sun energy is kept, like a blanket keeps the heat in at ground level. Very difficult to do, and it's partly explained why you see in many of these climate models differing estimates as to how much the planet will warm. 1 degree, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 5 degrees, even 9 degrees. It's because, granted, looking at what's happened in the past and what the data is indicated, but part of the problem is the difficulty of getting a really good handle on what clouds are doing. So that remains a continued area of active research. Clouds impact precipitation, the amount of solar radiation reflected back to space, which I just referred to, the albedo. This process could create a positive feedback loop. Cloud cover would increase the insolation reflected back to space by the atmosphere, potentially helping to cool the planet. That is, if cloud cover persists longer than usual, then there'll be more energy reflected back to space than is trapped at surface. That's kind of what they're getting at that point. So this will potentially help cool the planet, support more polar habitats for sea ice algae. As of 1987, research has suggested that a doubling of cloud condensation nuclei, of which DMS is one type, would be required to counteract warming due to increased atmospheric CO2 concentrations. So let's talk about albedo. Let's get specifically what it means. Meaning whiteness is the measure of the diffuse reflection of solar radiation out of the total solar radiation, and measured on a scale from 0, which corresponds to a black body that absorbs all incident radiation, like trees, bare ground, all the way up to 1, which corresponds to a body that reflects all incident radiation. Example would be snow. Surface albedo is defined as the ratio of radiosity to the irradiance, flux per unit area, received by a surface. Now, flux is simply a measure of the concentration per unit area per unit time. So in other words, if you wanted to look at what is the flux of nitrate, for example, okay, the nitrate might be so many milligrams per liter per second. In other words, there's so much concentration that moves per second. So this is a movement measurement. It's measuring the flux per unit area per unit of time. That's what flux is. And we have ways to calculate this using lovely triple integrals and so forth, but there's a way to directly calculate this, these values. The proportion reflected is not only determined by properties of the surface itself, but also by the spectral and angular distribution of solar radiation reaching the Earth's surface. That, in other words, the angle of the sun. The lower the sun is in the sky, the more reflectance back into space there will be. As the sun angle increases, more absorption can be expected. Again, it depends on the surface. These factors vary with atmospheric composition, geographic location, and time, basically time of year. Albedo is the directional integration of reflectance over all solar angles in a given period. Due to measurement constraints, it is often given for the spectrum in which most solar energy reaches the surface, which can be anywhere between 0.3 and 3 micrometers or microns, or converted into nanometers, 300 to 3,000 nanometers. The spectrum includes the visible light, which is found in the 0.4 to 0.7 micrometers or 400 to 700 nanometers. The average albedo of the Earth from the upper atmosphere, its planetary albedo, is 30 to 35% because of cloud cover. This widely varies locally across the surface because of different geological, environmental features, properties. Solar irradiance is the power per unit area, typically measured as watts per square meter, received from the sun in the form of electromagnetic radiation, as reported in the wavelength range of the measuring instrument. Solar irradiance is often integrated over a given time period in order to report the radiant energy emitted into the surrounding environment. This is measured as joules per square meter during the time period under consideration. This integrated solar irradiance is called solar irradiation, solar exposure, solar insolation, or simply insolation. And insolation is typically the term that gets used. Irradiance may be measured in space or at the Earth's surface after atmospheric absorption and scattering. Irradiance in space is a function of distance from the sun, the solar cycle, cross-cycle changes. Irradiance on the Earth's surface additionally depends on the tilt of the measuring surface, because the Earth's angle is at a tilt of approximately 23.5 to 24.5 or so degrees. The height of the sun above the horizon, that relates to time of year, atmospheric conditions. Solar irradiance affects plant metabolism and animal behavior. Thus, solar irradiance / insolation is the total energy reaching the Earth's surface or cloud tops. Albedo is the percentage of this radiation reflected back into space. Now, typically the insolation comes into the surface in the UV realm of the electromagnetic spectrum. It reflects back into space in the infrared, the IR frequency ranges of the electromagnetic spectrum. So UV is incoming, IR is outgoing in general terms. And we use those energy as part of our modeling calculations. Let's look at ice algae as a tracer for paleoclimate. Sea ice plays a major role in the global climate. Satellite observations of sea ice date back only until the late 1970s, and longer-term observational records are sporadic and of uncertain reliability. While terrestrial ice paleoclimatology can be measured directly through ice cores, historical models of sea ice must rely on proxies. Usually we use the ice cores to help reconstruct past climate models. and indirectly kind of take a measure of the sea ice. We also use sediment cores because when the phytoplankton die, they sink through incorporated into the sediment. So we can also look at the sediment cores to identify the phytoplankton species coupled with the isotopic fractionation methodology. We can then use these to reconstruct past climate, species distribution, the extent of sea ice, and other information we may be interested in. Organisms dwelling on the sea ice eventually detach from the ice, fall through the water column, called marine snow. Particularly when the sea ice melts, a portion of the material that reaches the seafloor is buried before it's consumed, is thus preserved in the sedimentary record. That's the sedimentary cores I just alluded to. There are a number of organisms whose values as proxies for the presence of sea ice has been investigated, including particular species of diatoms, dinoflagellate cysts, ostracods foraminiferas, forams for short. Variation in carbon and oxygen isotopes in the sediment core can also be used to make inferences about sea ice extent. Isotopic fractionation, that's the process which that is done. Each proxy has advantages and disadvantages. For example, some diatom species that are unique to sea ice are very abundant in the sediment record. However, preservation efficiency can vary. Brief word about terrestrial ice algae. Algae also occurs on terrestrial ice sheets and glaciers. The species found in these habitats are distinct from those associated with sea ice because the system is freshwater. Even within these habitats, there is a wide diversity of habitat types and algal assemblages. For example, cryocestic communities are specifically found on the surface of glaciers, in snowfields where the snow periodically melts during the day. Research has been done on glaciers and ice sheets across the world, and several species have been identified, basically being among the common varieties. However, although there seems to be a wide array of species, they have not been found in equal amounts. The most abundant species identified on different glaciers are Ancyonema nordenskioldi and Chlamydomonas nivalis. Implications for climate change. The rate of glacier melt depends on surface albedo. Recent research has shown the growth of algae darkens local surface conditions. Decreasing the albedo thus increases the melt rate on these surfaces. Melting glaciers and ice sheets have been directly linked to increases in sea level rise. The Greenland ice sheet, which has been retreating and melting at alarming rates. Sea level rise will lead to an increase in both frequency and intensity of storm events. Also, less sea ice means less protection to shorelines, allowing for storms to develop, which then induce massive erosion events. We're seeing this in Alaska with less and less sea ice. You get all these storms just batter the crap out of the shoreline, where you see whole chunks of land just dumping into the ocean. There's been a couple of villages in Alaska where they've had to relocate because literally all the land is just dumping into the ocean. They've had to relocate them a considerable distance further inland. On enduring ice sheets and snowpack, terrestrial ice algae often color the ice due to accessory pigments, popularly known as watermelon snow. The dark pigments within the structure of algae increases sunlight absorption, leading to an increase in the melting rate. Algal blooms have been shown to appear on glaciers and ice sheets once the snow had begun to melt, which occurs when the air temperature is above the freezing point for a few days. The abundance of algae changes with the seasons and also spatially on glaciers. Their abundance is highest during the melting season of glaciers, occurs naturally in the summer months. Climate change is affecting both the start of the melting season and also the length of this period, which will lead to an increase in the amount of algal growth. But with sea ice lessening, it is possible that there will be less algae over the long term. That goes back to what I was talking about, ice edge productivity plus pelagic productivity. If you don't have sea ice, you're not going to have this ice edge productivity. The pelagic phytoplankton can only be active at a certain sun angle, so there'll be a smaller, shorter season of productivity. This is an area of active research. So that's what's meant by that the overall productivity could be decreasing. Let's talk about the ice albedo feedback loop. Ice snow begins to melt. The area the ice covers decreases, which means a higher portion of land is exposed. The land underneath the ice has a higher rate of solar absorption due to it being less reflective and darker. Melting snow also has lower albedo than dry snow or ice due to its optical properties. So as snow begins to melt, albedo decreases, which results in more snow melting, and the loop continues. In other words, a positive feedback loop. This feedback loop is referred to as the ice albedo feedback loop. This can have drastic effects on the amount of snow melting each season. Algae plays a role in this feedback loop by decreasing the level of albedo of the snow ice. This growth of algae has been studied, but its exact effects on decreasing albedo is still unknown. The Black and Bloom, and there's your website, blackandbloom.org. Black and Bloom is all one word, lower cases. Project is conducting research to determine the amount algae are contributing to the darkening of the Greenland ice sheet, as well as the algae's impact on the melting rates of the ice sheet. It is important to understand the extent to which algae is changing the albedo on glaciers and ice sheets, because that will affect how quickly the ice sheets melt. Once that is known, it should be incorporated into global climate models and then used to predict sea level rise. Ice albedo feedback is positive feedback climate process where a change in the area of ice caps, glaciers, sea ice alters the albedo and surface temperature of a planet. Ice is very reflective. Therefore, some of the solar energy is reflected back to space. Ice albedo feedback plays an important role in global climate change for all the things I've been mentioning. For instance, at higher latitudes, we see warmer temperatures melt the ice sheet. However, if warm temperatures decrease the ice cover and the area is replaced by water or land, the albedo would decrease. This increases the amount of solar energy absorbed, leading to more warming, leading to more melting. This effect has mostly been discussed in terms of the recent trend of declining Arctic sea ice. And I've discussed this, not only in this video, but other videos I have done. The change in albedo acts to reinforce the initial alteration in ice area, leading to more warming. Warming tends to decrease ice cover and hence decrease the albedo, increasing the amount of solar energy absorbed, leading to more warming. In the geologically recent past, the ice albedo positive feedback has played a major role in the advances and retreats of the Pleistocene, approximately 2.6 million years ago to about 10,000 years ago, ice sheets. Conversely, cooler temperatures increase ice, which increases albedo, leading to more cooling, more ice growth. So melting decreases albedo, which increases warming, increases melting. Or on the other hand, you have cooler temperatures, increases ice. So in other words, you're increasing freezing. Then that increases the amount of ice, which increases albedo, which leads to more cooling, and so forth. So the positive feedback loops can go in either direction, depending on the conditions. So I wanted to show you this little diagram showing you how it cyclically works. So you have increases in temperature, which leads to increase in Arctic sea ice melting, which leads to darker surfaces being revealed. The albedo is reduced, so it's less reflectance of the surface, increased absorption of solar radiation, leading to increase in temperature, more ice melting. So there's your loop there, positive feedback loop. Another way to look at this is you have the sun energy is coming in, it's absorbed by the water, reflected off the ice. So you have warming, melts the sea ice, ocean exposed, lower albedo, increase in absorbed sunlight, leads to more melting, more ocean exposed, more increased absorption of sunlight, etc. And to show you some more, right? See a lot of energy being reflected off the ice. A little bit gets absorbed. Okay, so that little bit of absorption will eventually start melting some of the ice. See, a little bit more here than it is here. Some here, not here, right? So we're seeing some of the ice is melting back. Now it's absorbing a lot of energy, and this little uh, hue, if you see like a pinkish, reddish hue, is not an algal bloom per se. It could be, but it's to indicate increase in the water temperature, which will then increase the melt rate. So we're seeing lots of reflectance. It's decreasing. It is really decreased. And as this is happening, there's more and more energy being absorbed by the water, which warms up the water, which helps melt the ice and helps increase the rate of melting the ice to the point that all the ice gets melted, and now all that solar energy is being absorbed. And this is what we're seeing across the Arctic. This is part of the reason, because now we're absorbing that energy. The energy eventually gets put back into the atmosphere. This is part of the reason that the Arctic is warming up 2, now maybe 3 times faster than the rest of the planet. It's because of what's going on with the sea ice. A major contributor. Not the only factor, but a major one. So there you have it. I hope you found this presentation informative. You get a little background on the ice algae, but now you have an understanding of why this is a serious issue, especially when related to the climate issue at hand. I thank you for your time, and we'll talk soon. Hey friends, this is Jim reminding you to subscribe and share my videos. Also, don't forget to click the bell so that you know when I drop a video in. And I'm also asking for you to please support the work that I do by becoming a patron at patreon.com. Details in the description box below. Thank you for your continued support.